The 1930s. The decade that gave us the Universal Monster series and opened up the floodgates for horror blockbusters. Not all good stuff came from this juggernaut. Most did, but not all. And I might want to talk about one or two of those in this list. On top of the ones everyone already talks about, but still deserves praise. So let's not waste time. Number 5. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1931, by Rouben Mamoulian. We all know the story. Good scientist makes evil potion that makes him evil. It's a fairly simple plot, but the film pulls it off really well by having Hyde be just the worst. He is a manifestation of every sin under the sun and cartoonishly evil. But the film grounds his character by focusing his attention on a single person. A lot of his screen time is spent with an innocent woman he's forced into a relationship and is abusing for fun, which isn't some indiscriminate rampage, it's deliberate and personal. Due to their age, I don't expect any of these films will scare you like they did audiences back then, but this doesn't just want to scare you. It wants to make you uncomfortable, and because it was made pre-Hays Code and by Paramount Pictures, it was allowed to be a little more violent and a little more sexual, which is a cruel combination. And the work of the lead, Frederick March, cannot be understated. The makeup does a lot of heavy lifting, but the way he talks and moves as Hyde is completely different to Jekyll. On top of that, both characters change as the film carries on. Jekyll starts out calm and collected, but slowly breaks down, while Hyde becomes progressively more animalistic. Again, the makeup here is phenomenal. Which leads me to my next point. Somehow Hyde's character isn't even the most noteworthy thing about the film. That would be the cinematography. The film opens up with 3.5 minutes of POV shots, as Dr. Jekyll gets ready and leaves his house. The longest unbroken one being this as he walks through the house and to the carriage, which is 1.5 minutes long. This is most likely done as a flex, but it's pretty dated now. However, it still serves a purpose because POV shots are done later in the film during the first transformation sequence, which would have been jarring, but thanks to this opening we're a little desensitized, and its use in this sequence is incredibly effective. Also, what's a better way of getting inside the audience's head than putting them inside the character's head? Another cool trick is the transition that looks like an early version of what Star Wars would popularise, except these stop partway through for a little bit, so for a moment you see both scenes side by side. So the film uses it when the scenes are connected in some way, like when Mr. Hyde walks away from a party Dr. Jekyll is supposed to attend. Then there's a transformation sequence, which I'm not even going to get into, because even with the special tricks aside, this film is just really well blocked and lit. If you have any interest in early cinema, you need to watch this. It's really experimental, and some people, me, would go as far as to say it's the second best directed horror film from the 30s, which is a bold statement given what's on this list. Overall, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a great film that stands the test of time, one I plan to rewatch every October, and something I could easily make a whole video on. And it's only number 5. Number 4. The Old Dark House, 1932, by James Whale. This is the worst horror film James Whale ever made. Spoilers, I guess. It follows people who are travelling when a storm forces them off the road and into an old dark house, owned by a quirky and different family where they must spend the night. The star of the show has got to be the house itself. It's tied to the family that lives in it, who have so much personality, history and secrecy. The film drip feeds you information, raising a lot of questions it doesn't fully answer. And when the film's over, it doesn't resolve all the conflicts, it just ends. Which I love because it feels like a single chapter in a larger story. The house was here before we came, and it'll be here after we leave. This was another film I could make a whole video on, and almost did, but a lot of its power is in its incredible atmosphere, which is best described briefly and vaguely. I'm not even going to talk about the characters, despite some being really interesting, because I want the main takeaway from this segment to be the house. The house is my favourite character, and the main character, and you need to watch this if you haven't already. Number 3. Vampire, 1932, by Karl Theodor Dreyer. Originally shot as a silent film by one of the defining directors of the silent era, this is one of those films that's not really trying to tell an interesting story and is more about conveying emotions. It instills senses of confusion and dread through the best direction of any horror movie from the 30s and 40s, and it's not particularly close. When I first watched it, I'd never seen a film use shadows quite like this before, and I've yet to find another since. If the film was longer, I could see the visuals getting stale, but with a runtime of 1:13, that's not a problem. Number 2. The Invisible Man, 1933, by James Whale. Pivoting from that privately funded, truly unique cinematic experience, this is a studio system blockbuster surrounding what is now one of the most iconic fictional characters of all time. The story follows Dr. Jack Griffin, a scientist who's turned himself invisible. I adore the film's opening, which starts with a solitary figure in a snowstorm, then transitions into a lively bar where people are laughing, chatting and playing games, then a door opens and the tone completely shifts as the snow and wind gush inside. It's an immediate tone setter and some neat foreshadowing. In the first half, Griffin seems like a weird arsehole, but turns into a tragic figure as we learn how being invisible has affected his life, and see his fear and desperation around finding a way back to being normal. But we also learn something even Griffin doesn't know, that the process that turned him invisible will also turn him mad, leading to the second half where he becomes the film's villain, and unlike Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the film doesn't try to ground him. He becomes a maniacally laughing mad scientist who genuinely wants to take over the world. Griffin is played by Claude Rains, and it's clear through his performance just how much fun he's having, which is extremely impressive given he doesn't have his face or sometimes even body language to express through. The little scene I really appreciate was when Griffin sits down and discusses the logistics of being invisible. If he goes out in the rain, the water can be seen on him. In the fog, you can see him like a bubble, and whenever he comes inside, he needs to wash his feet and clean the dirt from under his fingernails. None of this is plot relevant, but it makes the audience engage with the finer details, and characterises Griffin as he demonstrates how much thought he's put into this. It also builds the stakes because Griffin isn't something that can be defeated through brute force. You need to outsmart him, which seems pretty damn hard. Finally, you can't talk about this film without mentioning the special effects. They're pretty good. They've definitely aged, but due to the film's light tone, I don't think that detracts from it at all. In fact, the director would go out of his way to make things look less realistic in his next film, so this maybe makes it even better in a way. I know it sounds like I'm just making excuses, but that's only because I am. Honourable mentions The Son of Frankenstein, which has too many problems to be on this list. You could even make a whole video on why it's not as good as the first two, cough cough, but it's a personal favourite and maybe the prettiest 30s horror movie. Number 1. Frankenstein, 1931, and Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, by James Whale. Combining these is cheating, but if I didn't, James Whale would take up 4 of the top 5. If you worry combining these effects with placement, don't, they're both this high on their individual merits, and if you're curious, I think Bride's the best. The first film follows a mad genius with a god complex called Henry Frankenstein, who's on a quest to create life. It perfectly encapsulates everything I love about the Universal Monster series. Gorgeous sets, dark atmosphere, eccentric characters, and memorable monsters. But what sets it apart from the rest is its thematic richness. Even if you only have a tangential understanding of the characters, you know how much of the story is tied to man playing God and nature versus nurture. Speaking of, there's one scene I see get a lot of flack when I actually kinda like it. Frankenstein sends his assistant to go fetch a brain for the monster. The assistant tries to get a healthy normal brain, but instead gets a criminal brain, which a lot of people don't like because they think the film's saying that's the reason the monster turns bad instead of his mistreatment, which waters down the theme. But no, there's a clear cause and effect to the monster's behaviour. You could take the scene out and nothing would change, so it's not responsible for anything. The only thing it affects is the audience. It's one of many bad omens that plants negative expectation of what the monster will be in their heads, so that later it can subvert those expectations and make them question themselves. I actually really like the scene, but people hate it, and the sequels validate their hatred by having characters say, "Yeah, nah mate, it was just the criminal brain," which, okay, no, I'll be here for ages. Son, your line's okay. Ghost, yours can die in a hole. I'll leave it at that. Where the first film followed Henry as he created life, Bride follows the monster as he tries to live life. He goes on a run from angry villagers trying to imprison or kill him, partakes in earthly pleasures like eating, drinking and smoking, and most importantly, he tries to find companionship. A fair amount of people think the first is better, which is understandable. Stylistically, they're pretty different, and I can absolutely see why you'd prefer the first subdued dreariness to the more bombastic and comedic tone of Bride. And something major the first film has going for it is Colin Clive gave a much stronger performance as Henry. And as a whole, Henry's character in the sequel is a downgrade, which isn't saying much given he's not the main focus and underwent a lot of change, but I digress. With all that said, I still think Bride is better. Not by much, I think most scenes in each film are comparable in quality, but Frank doesn't have anything quite on the level of the scenes in Bride with the old blind man, or its incredible ending, while Bride doesn't have anything as downright bad as Frankenstein's ending. Finally, and I won't go too deep into this because it's not how I personally prefer to interpret them, but it needs to be said you can read a good chunk of gay subtext in them, and James Whale was an openly gay director, so there are essential films in the history of queer cinema if that's something you're interested in. Overall, these two movies are really something special, and for my money, the best horror films of the decade. But what do you think? Did I leave any out that you think deserve a spot? Do you disagree with my order? Tell me in the comments, and if you liked the video, consider watching another. Cheers.